You are listening to Art Destinations, a podcast where we host fortnightly conversations with artists and thinkers living and or working on islands to see how these unique places shape imaginations. This season will be set in Tasmania, following on from our Venice series. Hello, my name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Whitewater, Tasmania. I am in conversation with my friend Matthew Newton, a photojournalist and cinematographer whose work brings attention to Tasmania's critical environmental issues. Our discussion takes us on a journey to places most of us will never have the chance to experience. Matt raises thought-provoking questions about the concept of wilderness. On our Instagram page, artdestinations.podcast, you can see some of the pictures Matt is referring to in our conversation. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave us a review. Your contribution supports us. Hi Matt, welcome to Art Destinations Tasmania. It's great to have you on the show.
Hi Sarah, great to be here.
So you forged a career over the last 25 years in photojournalism and cinematography, covering some of the biggest environmental issues facing Tasmania. Your role as a witness, bringing important stories to light, has been a journey made with poets, writers, artists, activists. In this episode, I'd like to talk about how working in collaboration, what that brings to the story, as opposed to just working on your own. So maybe we could talk a little bit first about what brought you to Tasmania.
Well, bizarrely, I came to Tasmania as an athlete, as a whitewater kayaker with the Institute of Sport. They were decentralising from Canberra and they were sending different disciplines all around Australia. So they sent the cricketers to Adelaide and they sent all the whitewater kayakers down to New Norfolk. So I came down as one of those and basically just stayed, trained there, went overseas to various World Cup races and World Championships. And in that process, went to art school and studied photography and fine art.
So did they put you through university when you were as part of the AIS?
I think they paid a living allowance, yeah, so they probably did. They paid for all my travel. It was fantastic. I spent about 7 or 8 years, which way more than I should have to get through uni because I was away so much. But yeah, travelling to Europe for 8 weeks a year or something like that. So it took a bit of a toll on my studies, but it was fantastic fun.
That's amazing. So what was the training facilities like here? Where were you training?
There's just some rapids upstream of New Norfolk and we used to train up there and then paddle around on the Doo, and it wasn't very high tech. Nowadays, like in 2000 for the 2000 Olympics, they built an artificial course up in Sydney. And most people now train on those sorts of artificial courses. But back in the day, we used to find a piece of river and just paddle around in circles until we got good enough to go and compete, really.
This would have been maybe 10 years or 15 years after the Franklin protests, the Franklin Dam. So were you influenced by that at all, arriving here, loving whitewater rafting?
I can remember as a kid, I can totally remember the Franklin Dam debate and the protests and stuff. But I was, only 10 years old or something when that was happening. But it definitely was part of, it was a big thing. And politics was a big thing in my house, in my family. And so I remember that election and I remember, I was concerned about the Franklin, but not actually understanding what it really was, I guess. Yeah. But having an idea that damming a river can't have been fundamentally a good thing. Yeah, so I guess my honours project, on my honours year, I'd pretty much finished competitive kayaking. So that meant I had a lot more time to spend on larger projects rather than just trying to pull everything together at the last minute. Because I'd done a few trips down the Franklin River by then and I'd spent a lot of time paddling lots of other rivers in Tasmania, so I'd become aware of how many wild rivers there were and just how much wilderness there was out there. But I'd also become aware of the fact that the Franklin wasn't, a wilderness, in a traditional sort of term. There was a very long history of people going up there and, exploiting it for timber and mining and all sorts of different things. So I was really interested in that sort of the back history of the people that used to live there. That's where my honours project came from. There had already been quite a number of oral histories done out there by geographers and things, and I got my hands on a couple of those. And what that did was sort of populated these places that I'd been to and that I didn't previously know people had lived at. So there was a convict history, there was a pining history and all that sort of thing, and then there was mining history. So there's quite a few sites where people had previously lived and that had the rainforest had grown back over. So my idea was to try and image these stories and go back to places that these interviews where people are talking about where they'd lived to see what evidence I could find. And I'd heard some stories about different, there's a great story about a railway carriage in the rainforest that had been lifted off the ground by the trees growing up underneath it and things like that. So I just wanted to, that sort of sparked my imagination. I thought I wanted to go and find these things and photograph them. So that's where that came from, yeah.
Did you find it?
Yes. Yeah, some amazing things. There was one story about a chap who took a bed right up the Gordon River for his honeymoon, and I managed to find the campsite, and there was still the 4-post bed. What was left of it was largely rotten, but because these guys made a lot of their furniture out of hue and pine and things, it lasted really well. So, and also the leather of boots lasts for years, so you could quite, and they used to put the food into cans and bottles, and so there's usually quite a lot of evidence in amongst the rainforest of where these little town sites or campsites had been.
Just outside Queenstown, there's that sort of a ghost town that you can walk into. It's an old mining town.
Oh, Pillinger.
Yeah, Pillinger. Yeah. Have you been there?
Yeah. So Pillinger used to have a population of 2,000 or 3,000 people. It was a big town. It had a couple of pubs and all sorts of things like that. So it's quite amazing that was a booming town, and now it's completely gone. A number of the houses, you can find archival photos of houses in Pillinger that are now in Strawn. So they actually moved the houses, to the other township because it was easier than rebuilding a house.
How would they do that?
Just on barges and things. It's quite incredible, yeah.
Oh, I love that, the spirit of adversity of, being so isolated and with not many resources having to really make do. So was this a project that you worked on or collaborated with anybody, or this was purely a project made in isolation?
I had met a fascinating guy called Denny Hamill, who was a West Coaster, grew up on the West Coast and lived in Strawn. And he used to drive one of the tour boats during the blockade. So he ferried people all the protesters up to the blockade camp. And I was given his name and told to go out and to have a chat to him because he was really young in the heyday of the Hue and Piners. So he knew all these guys, but he was quite a young teenager when it was thriving. And I was given he used to live in a little barge. He didn't have any money or anything, and he salvaged this barge and built a little 8x10 vertical board cabin on it, and that's where he lived. And he had a little boat that he'd salvaged as well, a little old fishing boat. And so I went out and found the jetty where he lived and knocked on his little door. And I think it would have been 4 or 5 days later I got back to Strawn. I just asked him a few questions. He go, "I'll show you," and then off we went. And so he sort of opened the door. So he took me on loads of trips up the harbour and showed me where all these camps were. And then finally I ended up getting my own tinny and stashing it up in the forest. But often he'd take me up and drop me off, and I'd jump in the tinny and spend a few days, and then he'd pick me up again. And he also introduced me to the other old piners that were still alive. So it was kind of like, meeting one person like that opens up a door to another whole world. So it wasn't sort of a formal collaboration, but it was kind of like a partnership, I guess. Then after that, I morphed into actually shooting docos, and it was at a time where the ABC was very well financed, or still had some financing. So between ABC and SBS, the two national broadcasters, it was possible to get, I think I probably worked on 1 to maybe 2, some years 2 large projects, which would be around about 30 to 50 days shooting, long-term observational documentaries. And that was over a period of about 6 or 7 years. And as a result of that, I really learnt how film communicated and how to make films. And so all that sort of informed, even though I was just working as a freelancer cameraman, I was learning a lot about just the power of storytelling, I guess. And during that time, we started an organisation called the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, which was a small environmental organisation, which is now in the last 20 years grown to be one of the largest private landowners in Tasmania. But part of the success of that organisation was the original board was a small board, but each person had exactly the right skills for what that organisation needed. And the skills that I had was being able to take really good photos and tell the story. And we had really good governance, and we had really good all these other things. So we were able to actually do the important stuff, but then present it to philanthropists and things like that. So as a result of that, we started buying larger and larger blocks of land and doing larger and larger projects. And then over time, we ended up part of an enormous area of land that used to be owned by a large logging company. So the logging company went into administration, and we ended up, or a philanthropist ended up buying an enormous amount of their native forest estate, and part of it was then given to the Land Conservancy to manage. And one of those blocks of land was a place called Skullbone Plains. And there were a number of philanthropists involved, and one philanthropist actually donated the money for Skullbone Plains. And we decided to do a project to sort of publicise the land, I guess, and talk about the conservation values and also how people connect to land and to space in Tasmania and to the environment. And so out of that grew this arts project where we had a dozen of Australia's best landscape painters. It was essentially like a wedding. We had a marquees and everyone camped on site for 4 days, and it was fully catered, and there was great food and great wine. But every day the artists would go out with the scientists and go walking around and just experience the landscape. And the end result was to make art and have exhibitions that we could tour around Australia to get this idea of this place and what was happening. And on the back of that, I was commissioned to make a documentary for ABC television with another local. With a local production company called Raw Film, and we made a half-hour doco about essentially how the artists relate to the landscape and how art and conservation, coexist.
Okay, and who were the artists?
We had Tim Burns, Julie Goff, Philip Hunter, Janet Lawrence, Vera Mola, Imance Tillers, Megan Walsh, Philip Wolfhagen, Richard Wastel, John Worsley, and Joel Croswell. It was a good spectrum, but largely quite well-known artists, and it was curated by Philip and Catherine Wolfhagen. So they drew all the artists together, and part of the deal was trying to make sure. Philip talks about it as organising a multi-day dinner party, making sure that everyone was interesting and going to be able to get along and also be able to camp and deal with all that sort of stuff as well. So no one's going to freak out in the middle of nowhere.
What did you learn from that? Because you were there as a person documenting that essentially, and producing that into the documentary and making a book. Do you put a book together? What did you take from that for yourself, for your own career?
Well, experiment's probably not the right word, but it was proving or trying to prove an idea to myself that was the power of film and photography to tell the story of a place and an idea and take that from something that's almost completely unknown and putting it into the national conversation. So the outcomes were we had exhibitions in Tasmania and in Sydney, and then we produced a catalogue, but it was more than just a catalogue. It was quite large, so it was more book than catalogue, so it would last longer than the exhibition. And then we had the documentary as well on national television. So, it was about a year later, after the whole thing was wound up, that I remember hearing something on Radio National, and there was a conversation between two people, and someone said, like places in the Tasmanian wilderness like Skullbone Plains. And I thought, wow, that really worked. It got out into the fabric of society just because the amount of, by having an event and telling the story, there was also a lot of associated media, so radio stories and magazine and all that sort of stuff. So that all media all just flows out into the conversation and built awareness of a number of things, built awareness of how the conservation that's going on there, how good the work that the Land Conservancy was doing, the ability for art to tell stories about places and ideas, and also the power of artists coming together as a group to tell a story about a place. So they're sort of the take-homes. And I think one of the really interesting things, and one of the things that made it really successful, was that because we had some incredibly generous philanthropists, there was no ask on the artists. Often something like this ends in an exhibition or an auction where then, the art gets sold off, and then the money from the sale goes back to the organisation. And it was interesting. And one of the artists in in the interviews in the documentary says this great line. He goes, often we do things like this and then the paintings sell for more than the land is worth. And, so then these artists who aren't necessarily, made of money are accidentally donating tens of thousands of dollars through their artwork. Whereas everyone got involved and everyone really had massive buy-in because nothing was being asked of them other than their skills of interpretation and involvement.
That's good. So all the projects from that point seem to be kind of really exploring this idea of visual communication and how to engage with audiences and how to bring people in and really forge strong connections. And that's particularly important in a place like Tasmania where we're not highly visible in terms of the national and international conversations. We are really at the bottom of the world. And when you're living here, you don't necessarily feel that. Or a little bit you do, but it's when you're away and you go to these places and you realise that Tasmania is not really part of their consciousness. So that's even more reason to create these successful projects and have people sort of throwing skull-bone planes around in a radio interview. So, I guess the Albatross project would be a good example of how you've taken a similar approach, almost kind of a formula, I suppose, and cut it a different way.
Yeah. So the Albatross project it started with I'd heard about this place, there are so many amazing places in Tasmania that are just out of the reach of most people or most people's experience. Albatross Island is a little bit further than that. It's 10 kilometres offshore off the northwestern tip of Tassie, and I'd heard about it for years. And I'd heard about it because it's got this big cave in it that people camped in it. It just sounded quite epic. But you're not allowed to go there because it's a shy albatross colony, and shy albatross are endemic to Tasmania, and they only breed on 3 small islands around Tassie, and the largest colony is Albatross Island, aptly named. And it's got a long history. Before the scientists were there was sealers, and when they ran out of seals, then they started getting stuck into the albatross for the feathers for the millinery industry. So the population of shy albatross shrunk dramatically. And over the last 30 years, the Tasmanian government has had a monitoring program on the island. So they go a number of times a year and they monitor the shy albatross through their life cycle. So every single bird that's on the island has a band on it. They live to about 60 years old and they mature very, very slowly, which is a real problem for evolving fast enough, particularly, with climate change. Yeah, when the young albatross fledge, they can leave the island for up to 7 years, and the scientists aren't really sure where they spend that time because they're out in the ocean, but it's such a large place, and trackers and things like that haven't been strong enough or batteries last long enough to follow them. Nowadays they've been putting some trackers on, and what's really interesting is it seems, or when I last was involved, it seemed like the albatross would go whichever way the wind was blowing that day, and then wherever they found food, they'd follow it. So some would stay local if there was lots of food. Others would fly as far as South Africa, just depending. So the issue with such a long-term science program that the community can't engage with is how do you secure its funding long-term? And so I was just having this conversation with scientists that were engaged in this project, and was like, well, if we could tell the story of the islands, then people would care more. If people knew they had this amazing place just offshore, even if they're not allowed to go there, just knowing it exists and also knowing that there are some fantastic stewards looking after them, they would secure its funding. They'd be less happy if the government were to end the funding. So that was the idea. The idea was to go and tell the story of the scientists doing field science. And the scientist running the program at the time, Rachel Alderman, had spent almost a year of her life living in this giant cave on the island, over a decade. 5 to 7 times a year they go there for anywhere up to a couple of weeks. There's nowhere to land on the island, so you literally jump off the front of the boat onto the rocks in between the waves, and they throw all the gear you need. So you can only get back off the island if the seas are calm enough in a place that's not renowned for calm seas. So they can get stuck on the island for many weeks. But it's such an amazing place. There's no trees on the island. The rock is a conglomerate rock, which is unlike most of Tasmania, so it just doesn't look like Tasmania. There's this giant cave that you live in because it's the only shelter on the island, because it's an incredibly windy place. But at night time, all the penguins come and live in the cave with you. So it's incredibly noisy. And then during the day, you go up on top of the cave and there's these 3 large albatross colonies with these giant birds that weigh about 4 kilos. And the scientists make their way through the colonies, reading the bands and counting the eggs, and then counting how many chicks are, born successfully and then hatch from the eggs successfully, and then counting how many chicks then actually get to an age of fledgling. Before they fledge, they then band them so they know once they leave, when they come back, each chick. And because they're so long-lived, what's really fascinating is that we got to a point where we suddenly realised Rachel could be reading a band on the leg of an albatross and realise, just by the numbers, that albatross is the same age as she is, which is quite extraordinary. So it is quite an amazing place.
What's it like in the cave? And do those penguins keep to themselves, or do they come over to you?
Well, the cave it's a wet, damp, quite noisy from the wind. It's a bit like being in a house on an incredibly windy day. And in the evening the penguins come in and they make, particularly when they're breeding, they make this crazy noise, kind of like a little piano accordion. And they'll also just bump into the tents and grab the guy ropes and heave on them and just do all sorts of funny little things. So it's quite a dynamic, really fascinating. You feel like you're out somewhere when you're there, and everything you do is about the birds and about the weather, because there's nowhere to hide from the weather. So you spend a lot of time just out getting nailed by rain and wind and all that sort of thing. So it's an amazing place.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you went there with Richard Wastall, the painter, and you were making a series of photographs, but you were also documenting what the scientists do and sort of raising awareness. So how did you find that balance between it's that line between documentary and art, and, that's a very, very furry line, but how did you navigate that, right? What was your thought process?
I think one of the good things about a project like that is you've got a lot of time, which you need to do more than one thing well. I think, so with my sort of more artistic photos, I try to make poetic documentary photos that can exist outside the pure sort of narrative of the story. And spending enough time on an island with the birds to be able to anticipate what they do. So if there's a weather event or there's some incredible light, I've got enough experience to know where on the island to go, to know which birds are going to be hit by the very last ray of light. Or there's some photos I took where I knew the conditions, and I just knew exactly where to go on this day, where once the sun left the birds, so they were no longer being hit by the last ray of sun, birds that were flying would fly up into it. So they only had to lift off the ground half a metre and then the light would hit them. So the birds in the colony aren't lit, but because they're white, they still sort of stand out. But the ones that have popped up into the sunlight then glow. But that just takes a lot of time to have seen it before, so that you recognise it's going to happen next time.
When you were working with Richard, it's hard to not be influenced by your surroundings and the people that you're with. And when you were there, was there some sort of sharing of ideas or influence between the two of you? Because your practices are so different.
Yeah, the practices are different, but the subject matter is, so we talked a lot about what we were seeing and things like that. But yeah, what's interesting about different mediums is the way they take the same thing. Occasionally you'd find dead birds, or you'd find a leg bone of an albatross that's dead or gone, so all there is left is the leg bone, but it's got the tag on it, so it's got this ring with the number, so you can find this thing and you can actually go and find the full history of this bird's life. So I've got photos of that as a still life, and Rich has his amazing charcoal drawings of the same thing, and it's exactly the same thing, but they're really quite different just because of the mediums. It kind of works, and it was just two different ways of looking at the same place.
How much time were you spending together each day? Were you actually walking off separately, or were you like as thick as thieves on the island?
Yeah, you'd sort of, so what would happen is this, we'd basically just follow the scientists, and then, we'd watch what they were doing for a while, and then we'd just go off wandering ourselves. And, the island's not big, it's only 18 hectares and it's quite long and narrow, but, you can walk along and go exploring and all sorts of things. So you just hang around for a bit and chat and watch the scientists, and Richard do some sketches, or he'd just take lots of snapshots, photos to remind him for later, and then do some reference sketches and things. He didn't produce any artworks on the island as such, but it was more about observing and getting enough material so when he got back to his studio, he'd be able to remember what he'd seen and make the works.
So the Weeping Tree is a project that the same philosophy from the TLC project, the Skullbone Plain project, but the Weeping Tree was really probably more driven by you, whereas the other one was more driven by the TLC. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the Weeping Tree project the idea was to tell the story of another endemic species in Tasmania, the cider gum, which only exists in the Central Highlands, and it's endangered because of climate change. Its special thing is it lives in frost hollows, so it needs very cold weather, has very thick, sugary sap, which means that the sap doesn't freeze in winter, which is the way the tree survives and outcompetes other sort of trees. The downside of having sugary sap is it's a fantastic food source for other animals, or animals in general. And in some of the trees actually weep the saps. No one seems to know or have seen a reason that benefits the trees. The cider gums look a little bit like a tree out of sort of Dr. Seuss kind of thing. So the idea was to make essentially a climate change story, but to wrap it up in an art kind of cover. So it was a climate change story masquerading as an art story. And again, it was a way of looking at how artists can tell a climate change story, and how artists can, through their experience and their interaction with nature, show the general public or people in general how to, different ways of interacting and different ways of caring, I guess, with the natural world. So what we did was we found 6 artists that were already working loosely in that area. One or two of them had done work in that area before with the trees, but some of them hadn't. And we paired some of them up with botanists. So they'd go out with the botanist, and the botanist would show them the trees and inform them about the trees, and then the artist would spend time with the trees and then go and make artwork about them. And we basically just documented that process. And it was 6 10-minute episodes, so the idea was people could watch it in little bite-sized pieces, and people could watch it online when they're commuting and all that sort of thing. And then we also paired it with some feature articles in magazines, so that the idea was that the story was just getting out on a variety of different platforms, and the feature articles then would finish with the URLs so people would log on and watch the films, and vice versa.
So if people want to watch it, how do they see it?
So what we did was we partnered with Australian Geographic, so they were the broadcaster, because they already had they're on brand as far as the story goes. It's a really good match, really good fit, and they also have a large audience. So it seemed we were looking for trying to decide where would be a place for them to go, and that was just the perfect place. So Australian Geographic had a feature article about them, and then a month or two later, the films came out on their online platforms. So they were able to promote them through all their online platforms, and then people can go watch them on the Australian Geographic YouTube channels.
Okay.
So
perfect.
It's just a really interesting way of telling the story in a variety of different places, and it's just accessing the market. Not many people watch free-to-air TV nowadays. So if what you're doing is about communicating, and if you're trying to tell a story, it's how do you get the story to the audience, and where is the audience? And in this case, it seemed like that was a pretty good spot.
So were these artists making work specifically for the Weeping Tree documentary in the same way that the Skullbone Plains project?
They all made work specifically for that project. Some of them had a history of working with the trees in the past. Philip Wolfhagen, a landscape painter, had one of his first major shows was of cider gums, and that was 20 years ago, so it was like a revisiting an area. So it was a bit of a nostalgic walk down memory lane for him, and quite interesting to go and revisit trees he'd painted and think about how some of those trees were now dead, some weren't. So that was quite interesting just to see how the trees were surviving. And also was an interesting way of looking at how his practice has also evolved. So that was like how the trees are evolving and how he was evolving and all that sort of thing, and the idea of generational. Like he used to go camping in those areas when he was a kid, and he wants his children to be able to go camping amongst those trees. So the idea that if you want that to happen, there has to be change. We had this fabulous artist, Lucien Rickards, who's done this multi-year project called Extinction Studies, where she was drawing endangered and extinct species, and as soon as she'd finished drawing them, she'd erase them. So I thought it'd be fantastic to pair her up with a botanist, Evie Lazarus, and send them on a little journey. So Lucien went out with Evie and explored this grove of trees, and then Lucien went back to her studio and this incredible charcoal drawing of a cider gum, and then rather than erasing it, and then there's a scene in the film where she sets fire to the artwork. So it's just to show that it's, extinction there's no coming back from that. It's quite full on, and that by doing that in a sort of performative way, that provokes conversation and allows her to tell the story to whoever's watching. So yeah, there's a variety of different approaches. So was there an exhibition, or the works were really just seen through the films? Yeah, the works are seen through the films because, well, Lucien burnt hers, so it doesn't exist. Makes it difficult. One of the take-homes from the Skullbone Plains project, and this came from Philip and Catherine, the curators, they're pretty well convinced that the best outcome or the most persuasive outcome from the project was the documentary, which is quite interesting. And I think that speaks a lot to the power of film to really be emotional for people, so to affect change. That the tricky bit with film is getting it to an audience. It's harder to see than an artwork or a book. So I think you need to try and get all these things out there so people can engage with it in different ways. Well, people know how to read a film or listen to a film, watch a film, whereas people can be daunted by an artwork. It's only a select few of people who understand how to read art. So it's got more of a universal appeal, film. Yeah, and I think it's a bit like, I've often used text or writers with my work, and I see that a bit like, I sort of see, particularly if you're telling documentary stories or environment stories, having just a still image is a bit like having a silent film. Whereas what I've learned from making film is that my job is to shoot, when I started was just purely shooting, and that's what I focused on. And then other people would edit and someone else would do the sound and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't really think that much about it, but as I've learnt and as I've become move more into directing and producing as well, you really understand how each one of those skills is a separate skill, and when each layer of a film adds up to, and that's why film is so incredibly powerful, because it's a really rich, emotive environment where, particularly in a cinema experience, there are no distractions, and the curators of the film are using every trick in the book. So I find using text with still images is an attempt to try and head more down that road. I don't think, I've never found using sound and things like that as successful outside a gallery space. I think it can be really successful in a gallery space, but again, that's limited because not many people go to galleries. But as far as images in books, for me personally, I find it, particularly when you're dealing with complicated, particularly environment stories or even social documentary stories, I think the text informs the images, and the images lift the text. It's interesting because your whole career has really been around how to get a message out most effectively and how to really connect deeply with your audience and to make that audience as broad as possible. And I really like the idea of the collaboration, collaborating, how you've been so experimental with the different types of careers or different types of specialist knowledge. I think that's really interesting rather than trying to be doing it on your own. One of your longtime collaborators is the writer, poet Pete Hay, and I saw on your Instagram page not that long ago when he was protesting and he was being arrested. So it's amazing to work with him and just be influenced by him. And I think that's one of the things for me. I think there are people like, Pete Hay, Richard Flanagan, I'm trying to think of the other, who's the James Boyce, who's a historian. He writes incredible histories that just bring these landscapes to life. And nowadays people like Robiano, that you suddenly realise that somehow, I don't know, they turn the atmosphere into words and influence the way I see and imagine Tasmania, and that then influences what I go looking for to make images of, what I'm trying to image, I guess. People like Robiano, his book Flame is just unbelievable, because for me it just brings to life all these ideas and dreams and fragments of history and stories you've ever heard in a pub and all that sort of thing. So they're the sorts of things that travel with me, and when I'm travelling around the state with any of my friends that do this sort of thing, they're the things we talk about, So that kind of informs the work, I guess, or it just floats around in your head. So it's funny when you see something, you don't realise something else is. You suddenly recognise the idea that you didn't know you had, I think. And that's kind of when I stop talking to people and start taking photos. That's where that comes from.
So Trent Park says that he always has a song when he's making his work. But would you say you always had a collection of books?
Yeah, I don't know. I go out looking with the collection, but it's funny that it's kind of like when you see something, you suddenly, your mind just places it in that whole compendium of influences that are inside your head, which that does include music, and books and all those sort of influences. Like, I guess it's the imaginary Tasmania I've manufactured in my head, or the way I want it to be, or the way I think it was, or whatever. So you're just out there waiting for something that images that, So, and for me, it's like, it's often waiting for epic things to happen, So, and that's why I do news work occasionally, but only for really big stories, because those things can metamorphosize into something completely different, like whale strandings. We get whale strandings where there's hundreds and hundreds of whales on a beach, and it's biblical, but it's also incredibly Tasmanian, because Tasmania is the world hotspot for whale strandings. So, and most people don't get to see them because they're in very remote places, and when they happen, not in a remote place, they're incredibly controlled, because you can't have public running around in amongst the whales, but it makes for the possibility of incredible images, because you have these amazing creatures. You have often amazing weather happening at the same time, plus you have these humans interacting, trying to save them. So it's like, well, we've got the elements. Now you've just got to try and be there and hope it all comes together, and when it does, you can make an image that speaks to something bigger than just a whale on a beach.
While all these projects are happening that we've discussed, you've also, you are a stills photographer primarily. That's your heart, and you were collecting, as you said, the whale strandings or the whatever it is. You're collecting a work which I think the title at one stage was Another Country, which is fairly apt, because that is usually what Tasmania. When anyone comes to Tasmania, they say, "Wow, this is like another country." So that's a whole nother strand of your practice, which is key to what we've discussed. But really what we've discussed is you communicating ideas about specific things, as opposed to you producing a body of work that's an extension of yourself and bringing those ideas together in a different way.
For me, it's about storytelling, and it's about storytelling about place. And in Tasmania, the environment is such a big thing, because we're an island at the bottom of the world, because, a third of it is wild country. The beauty of photography is that you can just go out and experience the world with your camera and try and make something that's worth something.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice to get back to something that's a bit simpler than trying to wade through all the stuff you need to wade through to make a complicated film.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, I think that's a really great way to end. Thank you so much for coming along, Matt.
No worries, thank you.
On our Instagram page, artdestinations.podcast, you can see some of the pictures Matt is referring to in our conversation. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave a review. Your contribution supports us. Thank you for listening to the third episode of Art Destinations Tasmania. Be reminded about our next fortnightly conversation by subscribing to our newsletter on our website artdestinations.org. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.